Most organizations treat the Teams admin center like it's the control tower for Teams. They are wrong. It's a dashboard with opinions, it reflects settings, it renders policy objects, and it makes you feel like you're holding the steering wheel. But it does not decide who gets in, what gets a token, or what gets blocked. That authority lives upstream, in identity, long before Teams ever loads. In this episode, everything runs through 5 recurring scenarios: conditional access, guests, apps and OAuth, lockouts, and Teams is broken. First, define what authority actually is. The foundational misunderstanding: admin center control plane. The foundational mistake is simple. Admins confuse the place they configure something with the place the platform enforces it. Microsoft 365 feeds that confusion on purpose. It offers you a fleet of portals that all look like they're in charge. Microsoft 365 Admin Center, Teams Admin Center, Exchange Admin Center, SharePoint Admin Center, Defender, Purview, Entra. They share a directory, they cross-link settings, and they happily show you the same object in multiple places. That's the admin portal illusion. A lot of shells, one backbone. And because Teams is where users live, Teams Admin Center becomes the emotional center of gravity. People start there because that's where the pain shows up. Meetings fail, chat won't load, a guest can't join, an app disappears. So the admin opens the Teams Admin Center and starts changing knobs. But those knobs aren't the authority layer. They're downstream configuration surfaces. So let's be precise about terms, because this is where the entire mental model either becomes deterministic or collapses into conditional chaos. A configuration surface is where you write intentions into the system: policies, toggles, assignments, org-wide defaults. It's the paperwork. An enforcement surface is where the system makes real-time decisions: allow or block, issue a token or refuse it, step up authentication or end the session. That is the gate. Authority in this context means one thing: the component that can deny access at runtime. Not suggest, not eventually apply, not usually works. Deny. And Teams Admin Center can't do that. Teams does not issue tokens. Teams does not evaluate sign-in risk. Teams does not decide whether MFA happens. Teams does not decide whether a device is compliant. Teams does not decide whether an app gets consented scopes. Teams receives the outcome of those decisions and then behaves accordingly. This is why people keep troubleshooting symptoms instead of causes. They think they are standing at the gate, arguing with the guard. They are not. They are standing in the lobby, yelling at the furniture. Here's what most people miss. Microsoft 365 is not a set of independent products with their own sovereign control planes. Architecturally, it is something else: a distributed decision engine glued together by Entra ID. Services don't negotiate access. They consume tokens, they honor claims, they enforce whatever the identity plane already decided. That distinction matters, because once you accept it, a lot of recurring operational nonsense stops being mysterious. The random lockouts, the it works on web but not desktop. The policy is assigned but nothing changes. The guest is enabled but can't access files. The Teams app was installed and now everything is on fire. Those are not Teams mysteries. They are identity outcomes wearing a Teams costume. Teams Admin Center feels authoritative for 2 reasons. First, it has the word admin in it and it lists a lot of tenant-wide settings. Second, it controls user experience behaviors that are visible and immediate: meeting policies, messaging settings, app policies, external access toggles. That makes it feel like the source of truth, but it's the wrong kind of truth. It's the service plane truth, what Teams will do after access exists. The identity plane truth is where access is created or denied. Entra is the token issuer. Conditional access is the policy decision point. And that means the most important question in every Teams incident is never "what does Teams think?" It's "what did Entra decide?" This is also why Microsoft's documentation reads like a contradiction generator. Teams docs often say "configure in Teams." Security and Zero Trust docs say "enforce in Entra." Both statements are technically correct, but they apply to different layers. Admins read them as if they're competing instructions when they're actually describing a pipeline. A pipeline is upstream and downstream. Identity is upstream. Teams is downstream. And if you debug downstream first, you will waste time, create new failure modes, and eventually build a pile of entropy generators, exceptions, overrides, special cases, because the portal lets you. This is the uncomfortable truth. The Teams Admin Center isn't lying. You are asking it questions it was never designed to answer. Over the rest of this episode, those 5 scenarios will repeat like a metronome. Every time the Teams Admin Center looks like it's in charge, we'll trace the decision back to the real authority. And the anchor rule is brutal but accurate. If it's not in Entra logs, it didn't happen. What Teams Admin Center actually is: a service plane console. Teams Admin Center is not useless, it's just not sovereign. It is a service plane console. A place where you tune how the team service behaves once identity has already done the dangerous part. It's where you define user experience defaults, feature availability, and service policies that shape collaboration after the front door has already opened. That is a narrower scope than most admins want to admit, because it means Teams governance is not something you can own inside the Teams portal. Teams governance is cross-workload by design, and Teams Admin Center is only one console in that chain. Here's what Teams Admin Center actually does well. It manages Teams-specific policy objects, meeting policies, messaging policies, app permission policies, app setup policies, calling policies, live event and webinar settings, and the long list of toggles that determine what users can and can't do inside the Teams client. It also manages service behaviors that feel like security because they're framed as security, external access settings, guest access settings, federation controls, messaging safety settings, and app availability. Those are real controls, but they are not identity controls. They're downstream capability controls. They assume the user already authenticated, already got a token, and already exists in the tenant in some form. So the best way to describe Teams Admin Center is this. It governs the experience layer of a composite workload because Teams is not one service. It's a front end stapled to multiple backends. Chat and compliance behaviors tie into Exchange services. Files live in SharePoint and OneDrive. Membership is backed by Microsoft 365 groups which live in Entra. App integrations ride on Microsoft Graph and OAuth. Meetings run through Teams media services, but the identity session still comes from Entra. Teams is an orchestrator. Teams is not the authority. That distinction matters when you're trying to reason about enforcement. If a control affects whether an access token gets issued, that control is not in Teams Admin Center. If a control affects whether the session gets challenged, constrained, or revoked based on risk, that control is not in Teams Admin Center. If a control affects whether an application can impersonate users or gain delegated scopes across the tenant, that control is not in Teams Admin Center. Teams Admin Center can't see those decisions happening because it doesn't own that pipeline. This is why Teams Admin Center has the weirdest kind of credibility. It presents tenant-wide settings with a clean UI. It lets you assign policies to users. It shows you that a policy is applied. And then users report behavior that contradicts what the portal says. Admins call that a Teams bug. Architecturally, it's something else. You are watching a service plane console render intentions while the identity plane continues to enforce reality. Teams Admin Center is also misleading because it's where collaboration gravity lives. If users are complaining about Teams, admins go to the Teams portal. That's normal. But it trains the wrong troubleshooting order. You start with the user-facing symptom, and then you try to reverse engineer the cause by toggling settings. That's not governance, that's entropy management with a mouse. The trap is that Teams Admin Center gives you tenant-wide confidence without tenant-wide enforcement. It can show you policy objects and assignments, but it cannot guarantee that the underlying identity session is in the state you think it is. It cannot force the client to re-authenticate. It cannot override token validity. It cannot retroactively apply a new access decision to a token already minted. It is downstream. It is always downstream, and the moment you accept that, the portal stops being a place you debug access. It becomes a place you configure service behavior for users who already have access. This is also why Teams governance discussions collapse into confusion when people try to keep it Teams only. They'll argue about guest settings in Teams, while ignoring that guests are directory objects with authentication methods, risk signals, cross-tenant constraints, and lifecycle problems that exist entirely outside the Teams portal. They'll argue about blocking an app in Teams, while ignoring that the blast radius of an OAuth grant lives in the enterprise application and the consent record in Entra. Teams is just one place the app shows up. So when someone says, we need to lock down Teams, the correct interpretation is you need to lock down the identity plane, then constrain data behavior, then tune the Teams experience to match, which means we now have to name the real boundary, because Teams Admin Center can configure a lot of things. It can even reduce harm, but it cannot create a deterministic security model. Only the token issuer can do that. And in Microsoft 365, the token issuer is Entra ID. Entra ID as the authority token issuer plus policy decision point. So now the only useful move is to stop arguing about portals and name the actual authority. Microsoft Entra ID is not where users live. It is not another admin center. It is not the place you go when Teams doesn't work. Entra ID is the token issuer, and token issuance is the moment access becomes real. Everything else, Teams, SharePoint, Exchange, even the Azure portal is downstream of that decision. They don't grant access, they consume access, they receive a token, validate it, read the claims inside it, and then behave like obedient little microservices. That is why Entra is the only authority that matters for entry. When people say Teams access, what they're describing is an OAuth OpenID Connect pipeline. An identity proves itself, policies evaluate context, and Entra decides whether it will mint a token that represents, yes, this identity may act. No token, no access. A token is not a convenience feature. A token is a signed assertion that the platform will treat as truth until it expires, gets revoked, or the session is re-evaluated. It is the permission envelope that services can't renegotiate. Teams can't bargain with it. Teams can't partially accept it. Teams either receives a valid token and proceeds, or it doesn't. That's the foundational mechanic admins keep trying to ignore because it means their favorite portal is not the gate. Now layer conditional access on top of token issuance because this is where the confusion gets expensive. Conditional access is not a Teams setting. It is Entra's real-time policy decision point. It evaluates conditions and produces outcomes. Allow, block, require MFA, require a compliant device, restrict the session, force a sign-in frequency, or apply app controls. That outcome happens before the Teams client loads your tenant branding, which means the Teams admin center can't fix access failures caused by conditional access because the failure already happened upstream. Teams is only the consumer of the decision. It can display the error. It can wrap it in friendly UI. It can give you a vague message that suggests you should contact your admin, but it can't change the decision. This is also where deterministic security collapses into probabilistic security. A deterministic model is simple, policy is consistent, and the decision path is predictable. You know what happens when a user signs in from an unmanaged device. You know what happens when a privileged role signs in from outside the country. You know what happens when risk is high. A probabilistic model is what you get after years of exceptions. Exclude this one user. Exclude this one country because our CEO is traveling. Exclude this one legacy client because someone's scanner is broken. Exclude this one app because the vendor can't handle MFA. Each exception is an entropy generator. It doesn't just create a hole, it creates ambiguity. And ambiguity is where incident response dies, because nobody can explain why access was allowed this time but blocked last time. And Entra, being a distributed decision engine, will happily enforce your contradictions at scale. Here's the operational anchor that saves hours and prevents mythology. If it's not in Entra logs, it didn't happen. Teams has logs. They are mostly about service behavior, meeting diagnostics, call quality, policy assignments, and client-side symptoms. Entra has logs about the decision. Authentication method, conditional access evaluation, device state, risk signals, token issuance, and the exact control that blocked or challenged the sign-in. Teams shows effects, Entra shows cause. And because this is a strategic teardown, not a troubleshooting session, the important point is not where do you click. The important point is the chain of authority. Identity plane versus service plane is not marketing language. It is the only model that explains why Teams governance keeps failing in otherwise competent organizations. The identity plane decides entry, who can authenticate, from what context, with what strength, under what risk posture, and with what session constraints. The service plane decides experience, what features are enabled, what users can do inside the app, and how the workload behaves after identity has already granted access. If you accept that, governance becomes coherent. If you refuse it, you will keep building policies in the wrong place, then act surprised when they don't behave like enforcement. Now we can do what the Teams admin center can't. Prove it. Because the next 5 scenarios all repeat the same pattern. Teams displays the outcome. Entra issues the decision. Scenario 1. Conditional access. Teams never decides who gets in. Conditional access is the cleanest way to expose the lie because it's the moment everyone feels like Teams should be deciding. A user launches Teams, they get prompted for MFA, or they get blocked, or they get a cryptic "you can't get there from here" message, and a help desk ticket that reads "Teams is down." And the Teams admin center is the first place people go because it's the Teams problem, right? No, Teams is the client that received a verdict. It didn't run the trial. Teams admin center has essentially zero visibility into conditional access evaluation. It can't show you which policy matched, which condition triggered, which control was required, or which step failed. It cannot tell you whether MFA was demanded because of sign-in risk, because the device wasn't compliant, because the user was outside a trusted location, or because an authentication strength policy required phishing-resistant methods. Teams admin center can't even tell you what token was issued, what claims were stamped into it, or what session controls were attached to it, because conditional access is not a Teams function, it is an Entra function. Conditional access runs at the point where Entra decides whether it will mint a token. That token is the contract. Teams doesn't negotiate contract terms. Teams just checks whether the contract is valid and then proceeds. So when someone says Teams didn't ask for MFA yesterday, but it did today, what they're describing is not Teams being inconsistent. They're describing policy evaluation changing because the context changed, the device compliance state changed, the sign-in risk changed, the user's location changed, the session aged out, or an admin changed a policy and the next token issuance reflected the new reality. Here's where admins keep losing time. They treat the Teams client as the enforcement point. They'll reinstall Teams, clear caches, toggle policies, reset user settings, and then declare that Teams is random. Meanwhile, Entra has a sign-in log entry that explains the entire story in plain text. Which conditional access policies applied, what grant controls were required, what session controls were set, and exactly why the attempt failed or succeeded. This is why the anchor rule matters. If it's not in Entra logs, it didn't happen. Not because Teams doesn't log anything. Because Teams logs the symptom, Entra logs the decision. And conditional access failures are decisions. Now, the uncomfortable operational split. Teams is down and access is blocked are not the same incident. Teams is down is a service availability narrative. Access is blocked is an identity control narrative. Most organizations blur them because the user experience looks the same. I can't get into Teams, But ownership is different, and so is the fix. If the service is actually down, you'll see it in service health, advisories, network paths, and regional degradation. But if the user is blocked, the fix isn't in Teams Admin Center. The fix is upstream: authentication methods, conditional access, device compliance, or risk policy. Teams can't override a CA decision, and it can't soften it. When conditional access says block, Teams receives no usable token. When conditional access says require MFA, Teams triggers the sign-in pipeline and waits. When conditional access says require compliant device, Teams doesn't get to argue that the user is important, it just fails. This is the part that exposes the illusion of control. Admins keep looking for a Teams side knob to allow this user into Teams. But there is no Teams side knob for that. Teams isn't the gate, Entra is the gate. Conditional access is also where organizations accidentally convert a deterministic security model into a probabilistic one and then blame Teams for the entropy. They create a clean baseline: require MFA, require compliant devices, block legacy authentication, enforce sign-in risk. Then the business complains. So the exceptions begin: exclude the executives, exclude the service accounts, exclude the meeting room devices, exclude just this one third-party integration, exclude the help desk because they get tired of prompts. Every exclusion is an entropy generator. And conditional access doesn't forgive you for it. It enforces your contradictions at scale with perfect consistency, which is the cruelest kind of consistency. Because now nobody can predict outcomes. Teams just becomes the place where the unpredictability becomes visible. So the correct troubleshooting order is not a process tip. It's a statement about authority. When Teams access fails, the first question is always, what did Entra decide at token issuance? If the sign-in log says the user passed conditional access and got a token, then you can talk about Teams service behavior. If the sign-in log says the user was blocked, challenged, or restricted, then Teams is irrelevant. It is downstream noise, and once you internalize that, you stop wasting time in the wrong portal. Now take that same misunderstanding and move it to guests, where the illusion gets stronger and the consequences get worse. Scenario 2, guest access. Guest equal on is not governance. Guest access is where the Teams Admin Center illusion becomes a compliance problem, because the portal gives you a toggle. Guest access on. It looks binary, it looks authoritative, it looks like governance. It is not. Turning on guest access in Teams is like putting a visitor's welcome sign on the building and then claiming you implemented security. You didn't. You announced intent. The actual control surface is identity: who can be invited, what kind of external identities are allowed, what conditions apply at sign-in, and how those identities get removed when the business relationship ends. Teams Admin Center can't own any of that. Teams doesn't create the trust boundary for a guest. Entra does. A guest is a directory object. A guest authenticates through Entra. A guest receives tokens from Entra. And that means every meaningful guest control lives where the token decisions live. B2B collaboration settings, cross-tenant access settings, authentication method policy, conditional access, sign-in risk, access reviews, lifecycle workflows, entitlement management. Teams is downstream. So when an organization says we enabled guest access, what they usually mean is we allowed the Teams client to render experiences for accounts that already exist in our tenant. That is a very different statement. Here's the failure pattern that repeats in every tenant. A business unit invites external partners. It starts small. A vendor, a consultant, a customer. Teams gets used because it's frictionless. The Teams Admin Center toggle stays on because nobody wants to be the person who breaks collaboration. Then time passes. Contracts end. Projects close. People rotate. And the guests remain. Because guest sprawl is not a Teams problem. It is identity sprawl. Teams didn't create those objects. Teams isn't responsible for their life cycle. Teams won't clean them up. And Teams can't enforce that guests must re-justify their access every 90 days, or that access expires automatically, or that invitations require approval, or that risky sign-ins trigger blocks. Entra can. This is where governance either becomes deterministic or collapses into vibes. Deterministic guest governance is simple. You define who can invite, you define which partner orgs are allowed, you define the sign-in conditions, and you define the removal mechanism. Then you audit it repeatedly because entropy accumulates. Probabilistic guest governance is what most organizations run. Guest access is on. Invitations happen ad hoc. Nobody owns removals, and the only control is hoping team owners behave. Hope is not a control. Teams Admin Center encourages this because it keeps guest management framed as a Teams feature. You can toggle guest access. You can tune what guests can do inside Teams. You can adjust messaging and meeting behaviors. And none of it answers the real question. Should this external identity be allowed to authenticate to your tenant at all under this context right now? That's an Entra question. This is why the weirdest guest incidents always resolve back to identity. Guests can join the team but can't access files. That's not a team setting. Files live in SharePoint. The guest's authorization to SharePoint is mediated by Entra-issued tokens and the SharePoint permission model. Teams is just the client presenting the failure. Guest is blocked in Teams, but still accesses SharePoint through a browser. And that's almost always policy scope mismatch. Conditional access, cross-tenant access rules, or authentication strength applies differently across apps and clients. Teams didn't create the inconsistency. You did by treating the Teams toggle as governance instead of treating identity as the boundary. And then there's the more subtle failure. Guests who sign in successfully behave normally and still represent risk because the organization never required strong authentication for them. MFA requirements, authentication strength, sign-in risk policies, device restrictions, session controls, those are identity controls. Teams cannot enforce them. Teams can only inherit them. So if you want to govern guests in teams, you don't start in teams. You start with Entra's definition of external collaboration. You control who can be invited and from which organizations. You put conditional access in front of those identities. You decide whether guests can use unmanaged devices. You run access reviews so stale guests get removed. And if you're mature, you package guest access as a governed entitlement with approvals and expiration instead of a permanent directory object created by whoever felt like clicking add member. Then and only then Teams becomes predictable. Because Teams will happily host any identity that Entra allows to authenticate. Teams has no opinion, it has no veto, it has no authority. That is the uncomfortable truth behind every guest governance conversation. The guest boundary is not a Teams boundary, it is an identity boundary. And if you try to solve guest sprawl with Team settings, you will fail in slow motion, while the directory fills with external identities that nobody can justify during an audit. Now take that same misunderstanding, thinking the Teams portal is the gate, and apply it to apps, where the blast radius stops being one guest and becomes your entire tenant. Scenario 3. Apps and OAuth abuse. The permission blast radius isn't in Teams. Apps are where the Teams admin center becomes actively misleading, because it shows you the thing you can see, not the thing that matters. In Teams admin center, you get a catalog. You can allow an app, block an app, pin an app, manage app permission policies, and feel like you're controlling the ecosystem. And yes, those controls affect what users can install and what shows up in the client, but that's not where the real risk lives. The blast radius of a Teams app is almost never a Teams app problem. It is an OAuth problem. It is an identity permission problem. It is a service principal problem. Teams admin center shows you an app as a tile. Entra shows you the object that actually acts, the enterprise application, the service principal, the consent grants, the delegated scopes, the application permissions, and the directory role assignments if somebody got ambitious. That distinction matters, because attackers don't need to compromise Teams to compromise Teams. They need to compromise consent. Here's the pattern. A user gets prompted to sign in to a helpful app, or they click a link in a chat, or they approve a permissions dialog that looks like normal Microsoft friction. The app requests permissions that sound reasonable to a non-expert. Read your profile, read your mail, access your files, maintain access you have been granted. And the moment the user clicks accept, Entra doesn't just let the app show up in Teams. Entra creates an authorization pathway. Tokens get minted for that app, scopes get granted, refresh tokens can exist, access becomes durable. And the app can now call Microsoft Graph in ways the Teams admin center cannot model, cannot visualize, and cannot explain. Teams is simply one of the places the app is surfaced. So when people say we blocked the app in Teams, what they often did is hide the button. They did not remove the trust relationship. The consent grant can still exist. The enterprise app object can still exist. The permissions can still exist. And the token issuance engine will still honor them because you told it to. The uncomfortable truth is this. Teams app governance without Entra app governance is theater, because the problem isn't the app list. The problem is what the app can do after it has identity. And this is where admins keep mistaking visibility for control. Teams admin center can show you that an app is allowed. It cannot show you that the app has delegated permission to read mail in the background, or that it has application permission to read all files, or that it has been granted offline access so the session can persist, or that it has consented scopes that effectively turn your users into a permission proxy. Teams can't show that because Teams doesn't own that graph. Entra does. Now take it one step darker. Illicit consent. This isn't exotic, it's boring. That's why it works. The attacker doesn't break MFA. They don't brute force a password. They don't need a 0 day. They convince a user to approve a consent prompt, and Entra does the rest like a loyal automation engine. And because the consent happens in the identity plane, you can't fix it in the Teams service plane. You can remove the app from Teams. The tokens still exist until they don't. The service principal still exists until you remove it. The grants still exist until you revoke them. The access is already upstream. So the governance rule is simple and brutal. Treat app permissions like privileged access, not productivity features. Because in architectural terms, an app with broad delegated scopes is a lateral movement tool you installed on purpose. And when people say, but it's just a Teams app, the correct response is, Teams is not the resource. Microsoft Graph is the resource. Exchange is the resource. SharePoint is the resource. Your directory is the resource. Teams is the wrapper. So if you're serious about Teams app governance, your questions shift. Not is the app allowed in Teams, but what identity object exists in Entra? What permissions does it have? Who consented? What can it call? And how do we revoke it fast? That's why most real Teams breaches feel weird when you try to investigate them through Teams. The activity shows up in Teams, but the control path was minted elsewhere. The authority was identity. The compromise was consent. The persistence was token issuance. And once again, the anchor rule holds. If it's not in Entra logs, it didn't happen. Teams will show you the place the user clicked. Entra will show you the moment you delegated trust. Now, when this goes wrong, the next failure mode is predictable. Users can't sign in, the Teams client becomes a looping mess, and the Teams admin center becomes a dead end, because Teams is still not the judge. Scenario 4. Lockouts and access bugs. Teams is the messenger, Entra is the judge. Lockouts are where the Teams admin center stops being misleading and starts being useless. Because the failure looks like a Teams problem. The client spins, the sign-in window loops, the user gets bounced back to welcome, or they see the generic something went wrong message that could mean anything. The ticket that lands in your queue reads like a service incident. Teams won't let me log in. So the admin does what they were trained to do, open the Teams admin center and look for the user, the policy, the setting that must have broken. And they find nothing, because the Teams admin center can't tell you why a sign-in failed. It can't show you the conditional access evaluation result. It can't show you the authentication method used. It can't show you whether the token was denied, challenged, or issued with claims that the client can't satisfy. It can't show you whether the account is blocked, the password is expired, the user's risk state is elevated, or the session was revoked. Teams is the messenger. Entra is the judge. Most organizations make this worse by treating sign-in failures like client bugs. They clear caches, they remove and re-add the account, they reinstall the Teams client, they blame Windows Credential Manager, they blame the network, they blame the Teams service, they keep pulling levers that have nothing to do with the decision engine that actually denied the session. Meanwhile, Entra has a sign-in log entry that is almost offensively explicit. It tells you the application, the client type, the authentication protocol, the conditional access policies evaluated, the grant controls required, and the reason code for success or failure. It tells you whether MFA was attempted and failed, whether a compliant device was required and missing, whether the authentication strength demanded phishing-resistant methods, whether sign-in risk blocked the attempt, or whether the token never made it out of the issuance pipeline. Teams can't compete with that visibility because Teams isn't running that logic. This is the diagnostic hierarchy that most admins refuse to adopt until after they've lost an afternoon. Sign-in logs first. Everything else is narrative. If Entra didn't issue a token, there is no such thing as a Teams login problem. There is only an identity decision that Teams is forced to reflect. And yes, it gets stranger because Teams is a composite client. It doesn't just authenticate once and then behave. It uses tokens for multiple downstream services. Teams itself, SharePoint for files, Exchange for calendar presence and compliance surfaces, Microsoft Graph for the glue logic. So you can get failures that feel random because one token path succeeds and another fails. The Teams UI doesn't explain that. It just breaks in interesting ways. This is why admins end up in the everything looks right in Teams paradox. They look at policy assignment in Teams admin center. They look at licensing. They look at the user object. They see no obvious misconfiguration, and yet the user can't sign in or can sign in on web but not desktop, or can join meetings but can't load chat. That is not Teams being haunted. That is token reality. Different clients trigger different conditional access conditions. Different session controls apply differently. Device compliance checks behave differently across browser versus rich client. Legacy authentication pathways can exist for some workloads. And the net result is that the user experience becomes inconsistent, while the identity system remains perfectly consistent with the policies you wrote. That distinction matters because it changes how you assign ownership. Helpdesk teams love the Teams admin center because it feels like the right place to troubleshoot a Teams problem. But the moment the symptom is can't sign in, the Teams admin center is downstream noise. The correct tool is Entra. The correct record is the sign-in event. The correct question is, what decision did the identity plane make? This is also where organizations learn, painfully, that admin does not mean omniscient. A Teams admin can configure policies all day and still not be able to explain access outcomes if they aren't reading Entra signals. And a security admin can fix the problem in Entra and never touch Teams. That's not politics. That's architecture. So when you hear user is stuck in a login loop, translate it properly. It usually means a conditional access requirement can't be satisfied by this client, or the token exchange fails due to claims requirements, or the session is being repeatedly challenged because the policy demands re-authentication and the client isn't aligning with it. And none of that is solvable in Teams Admin Center. The only stable way out is to stop treating Teams as the decision maker. Treat it as the renderer of downstream effects. Pull the Entra sign-in log, read the policy evaluation, fix the upstream decision. Because the anchor rule remains undefeated. Teams logs show effects, Entra logs show cause. Scenario 5. Policy delays. Teams is broken, is usually token reality. Policy delay is where the Teams admin center illusion becomes a time sink, because this is the ticket everyone has seen. I assigned the policy, it shows assigned, but nothing changed. So the admin opens Teams admin center, checks the user, checks the policy, confirms the assignment, and then starts doing the ritual. Unassign, reassign, wait, sign out, sign in, reboot, maybe even create a new policy because clearly the old one stuck. And sometimes it works, which is the worst possible outcome because it teaches you the wrong lesson. Here's what's actually happening. Teams admin center is showing you the state of a configuration object and its assignment relationship. That is not the same thing as the state of a user's current session. Teams can only enforce what the client can present at runtime, and what the client can present is constrained by the token it already has. So if a user has a valid token and an active session, the service doesn't suddenly renegotiate reality because you clicked save in a portal. The service honors the token until it expires, until it gets refreshed, or until the platform forces a re-authentication event. That's not a bug. That's the entire point of token-based identity. Tokens are designed to be stable. They are signed assertions. Entra allowed this identity to act under these conditions. Services treat that as truth because the alternative is chaos. If every downstream workload re-evaluated policy continuously, you'd get constant flapping behavior and an unusable platform. So the platform does what distributed systems always do. It prefers consistency of session over instant application of new intent. That distinction matters because it explains why policy changes feel random to admins. They aren't random, they're delayed by design. You change a team's policy, but the user's client still holds tokens minted under the previous decision context. You change a session control in conditional access, but the user remains inside an existing session until the sign-in frequency threshold or token refresh triggers a new evaluation. You change device compliance requirements, but the user's token doesn't care until Entra is asked to issue a new one. Admins interpret that as Teams is ignoring me. No, Teams is honoring the identity contract it already received, and the Teams admin center doesn't tell you that because it can't. It doesn't own token issuance, token refresh cadence, or session lifetime controls. It can show you that a policy is assigned, but it can't force the client to re-authenticate to pick it up. It can't revoke what Entra already issued. It can't take control of the identity timeline. So the portal becomes a false feedback loop. You see the setting, you expect immediate behavior, you don't get it. Therefore, you change more settings. Each change is an entropy generator because now you've altered multiple variables while the user is still operating under the old token reality. Then eventually the user's tokens refresh, the identity engine re-evaluates, and something changes. You attribute the change to the last knob you turned in Teams. It wasn't. It was the next token refresh and the next policy decision point evaluation. This is also why it works on web but not desktop shows up so often in these cases. Different clients hit different token refresh patterns, different sign-in prompts, and sometimes different conditional access conditions. The web client might prompt more often, or the desktop client might hold a session longer, or the brokered authentication behavior differs. Same user, same tenant, different session mechanics, and because Teams is a composite workload, policy expectations drift even further. A Teams experience might require the client to access SharePoint for files and Exchange for calendar artifacts. If identity policy changes have uneven impact across those service calls, the user experiences a half-broken Teams. Chat loads, but files don't. Meetings work, but channel posts fail. Presence is wrong. The admin then goes looking for a Teams policy to fix a problem created by identity session behavior. That's how you end up with policy bloat. So the corrective mental model is simple. Control happens at sign-in, not when the Teams UI loads. Teams Admin Center is not a real-time enforcement console. It is not a policy decision engine. It is not a session governor. It is a configuration surface for service behavior that takes effect when the identity plane reissues the permissions envelope. If you want deterministic outcomes, you stop expecting immediate compliance from downstream services and start designing around identity session reality, token issuance, refresh, and forced re-authentication. And if you want to diagnose these policy delay incidents without mythology, you don't stare at Teams policy assignment. You ask one question: what token is the user operating under right now, and when will Entra be forced to decide again? Because when the user says Teams is broken and the portal says policy is assigned, the truth is usually upstream. The identity decision that makes the policy real hasn't happened yet. The entropy machine, exceptions, drift, and the slow death of determinism. Now step back, because the 5 scenarios weren't 5 separate problems. They were 5 symptoms of the same system behavior. Governance decays when you treat configuration surfaces like authority. And in Microsoft 365, decay doesn't arrive as a dramatic failure. It arrives as entropy, the slow accumulation of exceptions, overrides, and temporary workarounds that never die. Every tenant starts with a clean story. Someone writes a baseline. Require MFA. Require compliant devices. Control guests. Limit apps. Keep external access tight. It's coherent. It's explainable. It's deterministic. Then the platform meets the business. A pilot group gets excluded because their devices aren't enrolled yet. A regional office gets excluded because their network breaks location conditions. A vendor gets special access because procurement already signed the contract. A legacy integration gets exempted because the vendor won't modernize. A shared device gets carved out because it can't satisfy authentication strength. A support team gets exempted because they hate reauth prompts. None of these changes feel catastrophic in isolation. That's why they're so dangerous, because each just this once exception is an entropy generator. It doesn't merely create a gap, it creates competing truths inside your policy model. The tenant stops being something you can reason about and becomes something you can only observe. This is the real definition of conditional chaos. You write policies that sound deterministic, then you stitch exceptions into them until enforcement becomes probabilistic. The system still works, users still sign in, teams still loads, but you can no longer predict outcomes without consulting logs. And when you can't predict outcomes, you can't govern. Drift is inevitable because Microsoft 365 is not one decision engine. It's many engines consuming one identity authority. You can toggle a setting in Teams Admin Center, a related setting in Microsoft 365 Admin Center, another in SharePoint, and then wonder why behavior doesn't line up. The portals are not lying. They are describing their local view of a distributed system. But distributed systems punish unowned intent. If nobody owns the chain of authority, the chain becomes a rumor. This is why admin centers amplify drift instead of preventing it. They make it easy to change intent in 10 places, but they don't force you to reconcile intent into one enforceable model. They let you add exceptions without forcing you to justify them. And because those exceptions often solve a visible short-term problem, they get rewarded. That's the architectural trap. The platform trains you to trade long-term determinism for short-term relief. Teams governance debt is a perfect example, because Teams Sprawl looks like a collaboration problem, but it's actually multiple sprawl problems stacked together. Owners sprawl, because people hand out owner role like it's harmless delegation when it's really distributed privilege. Guests sprawl, because invitations are easy and removals are boring. Apps sprawl, because app installs feel like productivity until OAuth turns them into authorization pathways. External domains sprawl, because federation starts open, then becomes will block bad domains later, which is always too late. Over time, you don't just have gaps, you have ambiguity. Auditors don't only find that something is missing, they find that nobody can explain why a control exists, why an exception exists, who approved it, and whether it still makes sense. That is the true failure mode, not insecurity, but unexplainable security. And unexplainable security is what collapses incident response. Because when an incident happens, the first question isn't what's the setting, it's why was this allowed? If your answer is I don't know, but it usually works, you are no longer operating a security model, you are operating a superstition. This is also where Teams gets scapegoated. Teams becomes the place where entropy becomes visible because it's where users collide with policy. Teams becomes the narrative surface for failures created upstream. Token decisions, app consents, guest lifecycle, session constraints. So people say Teams is unreliable. No, your authority model is unreliable. The platform is doing exactly what you configured it to do, plus every exception you forgot you made. And that is the slow death of determinism. Not one big misconfiguration, 1,000 small compromises. A policy here, an exclusion there, a temporary bypass that becomes permanent because nobody wants to reopen the ticket. If you want a tenant that stays governable, you don't fight entropy in the Teams admin center. You fight it at the authority layer. You treat every exception as a debt instrument that must be paid down. You force justification, you schedule expiry, you reduce overlap, you stop letting portal convenience become your governance strategy, because the system will always enforce what you wrote, not what you meant. And at scale, that difference matters. Why Purview exists: identity controls, access, not data behavior. Identity is where you stop people at the door, but identity does not control what happens once they're inside. That's the part admins keep trying to pretend away because it would be convenient if Entra could solve everything. It can't. Entra decides who can act and under what session constraints. It does not govern what the data can become once a permitted user starts moving it around. That distinction matters because Teams is not primarily an identity problem after sign-in. Teams is a data exhaust problem. Chats are data, channel messages are data, meeting transcripts are data, recordings are data, files are data, screenshots, copy-paste, exports, forwarded messages, shared links, data. And Teams spreads that data across multiple storage and compliance substrates that the Teams admin center barely acknowledges. Teams chat and channel messages have compliance behaviors that tie into Exchange and Microsoft 365 substrate services. Teams files are not Teams files, they are SharePoint and OneDrive artifacts. Meetings create artifacts in Stream and mailboxes and calendars. And apps pull and push data through Graph in ways that are invisible if you only stare at Teams settings. So Entra is necessary, but not sufficient. Entra can say this identity may enter. Entra cannot say this identity may not paste account numbers into chat, or this identity may not send sensitive data to a personal email, or this identity may not share a file externally once it's labeled confidential, or this meeting recording must be retained for 7 years, or this conversation must be discoverable for legal hold. Those are not identity decisions. Those are data governance decisions. And that is why Purview exists. Purview is not an optional compliance add-on that you bolt on after you finish security. Purview is the control plane for data behavior in Microsoft 365. It answers a different question than Entra. Entra, who can act? Purview, what can the data do when someone acts? This is where Teams governance gets real, because Teams is a collaboration UI sitting on top of a data sprawl engine. People type, people share, people meet, and the platform faithfully persists those artifacts across services. And if you don't constrain data behavior, you're not governing Teams. You're just regulating who gets to create the mess. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most organizations think Teams governance is permissions and policies. Owners, members, guests, external access, app policies. That's all access-centric. But the most expensive incidents aren't someone got in. There's someone who was allowed in move data somewhere it shouldn't go. That's where DLP matters. That's where sensitivity labels matter. That's where retention matters. That's where e-discovery and audit matter. Not because you love compliance theater, but because these are the mechanisms that make collaboration survivable under regulation, litigation, and breach reality. Purview is how you stop Teams from becoming an unbounded data leak with a chat interface. Data loss prevention is the simplest example. Entra can require MFA and a compliant device. Great. Now the user is signed in from a managed laptop with a healthy session. And then they paste a customer's credit card number into a chat. Entra did its job. It authenticated the identity. It issued the token. Without Purview, the platform happily accepts the content, stores it, syncs it, indexes it, and distributes it to everyone in the chat. Congratulations, you just built a durable compliance problem with perfect availability. With Purview DLP, the system can detect sensitive info types in Teams chats and channels and trigger policy outcomes. Warn, block, allow with override and justification, generate an incident, notify compliance. That is a data behavior control, not an identity control. Now look at labels. Entra can control who gets into a team. It can't enforce that content inside that team is classified, encrypted, and constrained when it leaves. Purview sensitivity labels can define the rules. Whether a team can have guests, whether external sharing is allowed, what happens to labeled files, whether encryption follows the document, whether access is restricted to specific domains or identities. Retention is the other place Teams governance gets humbling. Organizations love to say, we're in the cloud so data is safe. No, Microsoft keeps the service available. You keep your obligations. Purview retention defines what you keep, for how long, and what gets disposed. It determines whether Teams chats persist for regulatory timelines or get deleted to reduce risk. It determines whether records become immutable. It determines whether content survives user deletion, and whether legal hold can preserve evidence. And when the incident happens, Purview is also where you prove what happened, because audit and e-discovery are not Teams features. They are compliance features. So the layered model becomes non-negotiable. Entra is your decision engine for identity and session. Purview is your decision engine for data behavior and compliance outcomes. Teams is the experience layer where users collide with both, which means the Teams admin center sits in an awkward place. It hosts toggles that look like governance, but it cannot enforce the two controls that actually define risk. It can't decide who gets a token, and it can't decide what data is allowed to do after a token exists. That's the real reason the portal feels like a trap. It's not that it's bad. It's that it's not the authority you need in either direction. The operating model. Identity decides, Purview constrains, Teams hosts. So now the operating model becomes embarrassingly simple. Not easy. Simple identity decides, Purview constrains, Teams hosts. That sentence is the only antidote to the Teams admin center trap, because it forces you to assign authority where the platform actually assigns it. It removes the portal-shaped mental model and replaces it with a decision chain model. And a decision chain is what Microsoft 365 is. Entra ID is the authority for entry. It decides whether an identity gets a token, under what conditions, with what claims, and with what session constraints. That is where allow and deny are real. That is where zero trust lives. That is where you can make access deterministic if you stop feeding it exceptions. Purview is the authority for outcome. It decides what data is allowed to do once an allowed identity starts acting. What gets labeled, what gets blocked, what gets retained, what gets audited, what becomes discoverable, what becomes evidence, what becomes a reportable incident. That is where you control the blast radius of normal permitted behavior. Teams is the host. Teams renders the experience for whatever identity is currently allowed and whatever data constraints are currently in effect. Teams isn't a control plane, it's a stage, and stages don't write laws, they follow them. Once you accept this, your governance posture stops being a pile of settings and becomes an authority map. Here's the practical architectural translation. If the question is, can this person get into Teams? You do not open Teams Admin Center. You open Entra. You look at conditional access. You look at authentication strength. You look at device state. You look at sign-in risk. You look at session controls. You look at token issuance. Because Teams can't answer that question and never could. If the question is, what can this person do with the data once they're in? You do not open Teams Admin Center either. You open Purview. You look at DLP for Teams chat and channel messages. You look at sensitivity labels for Teams and the underlying Microsoft 365 groups. You look at retention policies for messages and files. You look at audit. You look at e-discovery posture. Because Teams can't answer that question and was never designed to. If the question is, what is the user experience inside the client? Then yes, you go to Teams Admin Center. Meeting policies, messaging policies, calling policies, app setup policies, those are experience controls. They matter, they reduce harm, but they don't define the security boundary. That distinction matters because it changes how you assign responsibility. Most organizations distribute Teams governance work to the Teams admin, then wonder why the outcome drifts. Of course it drifts. The Teams admin can't author the upstream decisions that actually determine access and data behavior. They can only tune downstream features. So they end up owning the complaints but not the levers. The healthier model is identity teams own Entra policies and the decision chain for entry. Compliance and risk teams own Purview constraints and the decision chain for data. Teams admins own the collaboration experience and map it to those constraints instead of inventing their own parallel reality. Now, if you're hearing that and thinking, great, now I have 3 teams and 3 portals, yes, that is the system you bought. The platform is distributed by design. The only thing you control is whether your mental model matches that design or whether you keep pretending a service console can be a control plane. This is also why the 5 scenarios from earlier stop being incidents and start being predictable classes of failure. Conditional access issues become Entra issues. Guest sprawl becomes Entra governance. App consent abuse becomes Entra app governance. Lockouts become Entra diagnostics. Policy delays become token and session reality. And the data side becomes just as clean. Sensitive content in chat becomes Purview DLP. External sharing risk becomes labels and DLP, not wishful thinking. Retention becomes Purview policy, not mailbox folklore. Investigations become Purview e-discovery and audit, not can a Teams admin read the chat. This is how you build a tenant you can explain. Because governance is not having settings. Governance is being able to answer on demand 3 questions. Who is allowed to act? What is the data allowed to do? What does the service render based on those constraints? If you can't answer those cleanly, you don't have governance. You have configuration drift. So when the Teams admin center looks authoritative, treat it like what it is, a UI that edits service behavior after the real decisions already happened. Use it. Don't worship it. Don't debug identity in it. Don't debug data governance in it. Don't build your security model around it. Identity decides. Purview constrains. Teams hosts. Everything else is just portal convenience. Objections and failure modes. Why orgs keep treating TAC as the control plane? The argument always comes back in the same 4 sentences, because the platform trained people to confuse visibility with authority. First objection. But Teams has policies. Yes, Teams has policies the way a car has seat settings. Important, useful, and absolutely not in charge of whether you're allowed to drive. Teams policies shape behavior after entry. What features are available, how meetings work, what users can do in the client. That's valuable, but it's downstream configuration. It doesn't decide authentication strength, device trust, risk posture, or whether a token gets minted in the first place. If your question is, should this identity be allowed to act, a Teams policy is the wrong tool. It can only reduce harm after permission already exists. Second objection, but users live in Teams. They do, and that's the trap. Operational gravity is not architectural authority. People complain in Teams, therefore IT runs to the Teams portal. That creates a feedback loop where the portal becomes the default source of truth. Not because it's correct, but because it's close to the pain. And the platform reinforces that illusion by putting tenant-wide toggles in the Teams admin center, external access, guest access, app permission policies, messaging safety. It looks like governance. It feels like governance. It's presented in the language of governance. But those toggles are still service plane controls. They don't own the identity boundary. They don't own token issuance. They don't own the consent and permission graph. They don't own session constraints. They don't own data behavior. They are configuration overlays on top of decisions made elsewhere. Third objection, but we can't lock it down without breaking work. That sentence is the confession. It means the organization built collaboration on top of unmanaged identity and ungoverned exceptions. So every real enforcement control feels like a threat to productivity. And the response is predictable. Carve-outs, bypasses, temporary exclusions. That's not operational flexibility. That's architectural erosion. If conditional access breaks work, the design problem isn't conditional access. The design problem is that the tenant never defined a secure, repeatable path for legitimate work. Compliant devices, supported OAuth methods, proper app registration patterns, governed guest onboarding, and controlled external collaboration. When those pathways exist, enforcement isn't disruption, it's normalization. When they don't, enforcement feels like sabotage. So people retreat into the team's admin center because it offers softer controls, knobs that reduce friction without forcing hard boundaries. Fourth objection, but our tenant is hybrid. Hybrid changes where identities originate. It does not change where cloud access decisions converge. In a hybrid model, on-prem AD might be source of authority for attributes and sometimes credentials. Fine, but cloud access to teams still flows through Entra, token issuance, conditional access evaluation, and the claims that downstream services honor. Hybrid does not give Teams Admin Center more authority. It just adds more failure modes when identity drift happens between directories. And that drift is exactly why you need a clear decision engine and clear logs. The service plane console can't reconcile hybrid identity complexity. It can only show you what Teams thinks it was told. Fifth objection, but Microsoft made it confusing. Correct, and that's not an excuse. It's a design constraint. Microsoft 365 administration is a maze of overlapping portals and partial truths. The Microsoft 365 Admin Center looks like home base. Teams Admin Center looks like the team's brain. Purview looks like compliance theater. Entra looks like identity stuff. And everyone learns the wrong lesson. Pick the portal that matches the symptom. That's how you end up debugging authority from the wrong surface. The failure mode is not ignorance. It's portal-driven reasoning. You treat UIs as if they are control planes instead of treating them as configuration surfaces over a distributed system. So here's the real reason the Teams Admin Center remains seductive. It offers psychological closure. You change a setting and you feel like you acted. You can screenshot the policy assignment. You can tell the business it's configured and you can close the ticket, and then token reality shows up later and proves you wrong. That's why this keeps happening in every tenant. Not because admins are bad, because the system rewards downstream tweaking and punishes upstream enforcement with immediate friction. If you want governance instead of superstition, you don't debate portals. You enforce an authority chain. Identity decides. Purview constrains. Teams hosts. And the Teams Admin Center goes back to what it actually is, a service console that should never have been mistaken for a court of law. The mental model shift. Stop debugging symptoms. Start debugging authority. The fix is not another policy. It's not a new portal habit. It's a change in how you think about cause. Portal-driven administration teaches you to chase the loudest symptom. Teams errors, Teams tickets, Teams complaints. So you open the Teams Admin Center because that's where the symptom points. Authority-driven administration does the opposite. It starts upstream even when the symptom appears downstream. Because in Microsoft 365, most failures are not broken features. They're mismatched authority, an identity decision you didn't account for, or a data constraint you didn't design, rendered as a Teams problem. So the new rule is brutally simple. First question, what did Entra decide? Not what does Teams show, not what policy is assigned, not what changed in Teams. What did Entra decide at the moment the session became real? That means you orient your entire mental model around the sign-in event. Token issuance, conditional access evaluation, authentication strength, device state, risk posture, session controls, and claims. Because those are the inputs to everything else. If Entra blocked the sign-in, Teams is not broken. Teams is doing what it always does when there is no token. It fails. If Entra issued the token, Teams is not deciding anything. Teams is consuming a contract it did not negotiate. That distinction stops the mythology. Second question, what did Purview allow the data to do? Not what does Teams allow in chat? Not what does the owner role permit? Not what does the policy say in the Teams console? What are the data constraints? Is DLP inspecting Teams, chat, and channels? Are labels governing the group and site boundaries? Is retention defined, defensible, and aligned with your regulatory obligations? Is audit turned into evidence instead of noise? Because if Entra is the door, Purview is the physics inside the building. If you don't set the physics, you don't have governance. You have a login screen. Third question, what did Teams render based on those constraints? Now you can finally use the Teams Admin Center for what it actually is. Experience shaping. Meetings, messaging behaviors, app availability in the client, and the operational policy layer that sits downstream of identity and data. That ordering matters because it prevents you from doing what almost every org does, trying to make Teams act like an identity provider and a compliance engine. Teams can't do either. And once you adopt this model, the 5 scenarios you've been dragging around stop being confusing. They become a diagnostic compass. Conditional access issue, Entra decision guest sprawl, Entra governance and lifecycle. OAuth app blast radius, Entra consent and service principles, lockouts and login loops, Entra sign-in events and claims. Policy delays, token and session mechanics, not teams, randomness. Data exposure, retention, investigations, Purview. Then, only then, teams. This is also where you stop treating governance as a set of settings and start treating it as a chain of custody. Who made the decision? Where it was made? What evidence exists that it was enforced? And what happens when the context changes? Because governance at enterprise scale is not configuration. It's enforceable intent that survives time, staff turnover, vendor changes, and the slow creep of exceptions. So if you take one operational habit out of this episode, let it be this. When the team's admin center feels like the obvious place to start, force yourself to ask what authority it actually has over the thing you're trying to fix. If the answer is it doesn't, then staring harder at the portal is not diligence, it's denial. Team's admin center isn't lying, it's faithfully showing you the part of the system it controls. The mistake is asking it to answer questions that belong to Entra and Purview. And if you're honest, you already know this because every Teams incident that mattered ended the same way. Someone pulled the sign-in logs, someone found the policy decision, someone revoked the consent grant, someone ran the e-discovery case, and Teams went back to working without anyone changing a Teams setting. That's the architecture telling you the truth. Listen to it. Teams Admin Center is a service console, not an authority. Entra decides who gets tokens, and Purview decides what data can do after access exists. Subscribe and watch the next episode on Teams app governance and consent risk, because the next breach won't start in Teams, it'll start in Entra.